right, so we'll just give you a few of the highlights here. Todd's my alter ego on much of this, so much of this we do either together or he does or I do and stuff. So, but we've really built sort of a really nice, fantastic team of people around the country. So with Kevin Quigley, Stéphane Roussel in Quebec, David Morin, and then heading over to Prairie, so Kel Sundberg, who's here, and Ben Muller and Laure and Nicole, who pitched in on work that we did on BC, and internationally we've also put together, I think, a really nice network of folks from Johann Wagner in Germany, Jamie Farrell, who's here from Australia, with Hayden McComas, Jemana Nicklin in New Zealand, Tim Legrand in Adelaide, Keith Kozine, who's working with Kel on the Canada-US piece. I should also mention, of course, the support we've gotten from Jeff Hale, always terrific insights along the way. Dajane Triparty from Asia, Danielle Maillet, who's helping us on the Middle East and in North Africa, Thomas Cantons, who's working on some of the African challenges, Adriana Dorfman and a former PhD of hers who spent some time with us in Kingston on a fellowship, Rafael França, who's now just got a really nice promotion within the Federal Police Force in Brazil. So I think we've built a really nice team, and also a nice team of so both within Canada and outside of Canada that wouldn't have existed without the grant. And I think as a result, we're also really able to have some systematic conversations and some comparative conversations and research that just simply would not have happened without the wonderful team of people here. So why talk about security? Because ultimately, from a Westphalian state perspective, of course, it's sort of the fundamental assumption that sort of you have an integrity of your territory. Within that territory, the state can then exercise whatever powers the state needs to exercise. But it's also a basic assumption of our social contract, right? So that the state extracts sort of resources. We call this taxation in a progressive way, and in return for those resources, we expect sort of basic functions that the state needs to perform: rule of law, some public services, some public welfare assumptions, public safety, and security. So, and security both sort of from sort of internally, that we commonly refer to as safety, and security sort of from external challenges and external threats. So it's a fundamental conversation about the modern state, and as you all know, without going into much detail, because there's lots of panels on this, these fundamental basic assumptions that we've made about the Westphalian state simply don't obtain anymore with regards to borders. And so in the 1990s, we had the Susan Strange sort of crowd and conversation about sort of the state is disappearing. But of course, I think as Elizabeth, for instance, and her work has made very clear, and so many other folks here, the state is back, and the state is back in full force, as are borders and border lines. But the border lines don't, and the borders and boundaries that we have and the challenges that we deal with don't look like the ones that we're used to. And so there's lots of challenges around that we're trying to figure out. And so so three particular areas that we focused on as part of Borders and Globalization is so initially, so how the threat environment is changing, and on that in particular, work around transnational illicit networks. So one of the challenges since the end of Cold War is that much of sort of the security threat that previously used to be in sort of your standard military existential threat has changed. Everything from terrorism to drugs to human smuggling, human trafficking, illicit arms trade, illicit capital or money laundering, terrorist financing, aggressive tax evasion. So trying to understand sort of how, and the problem is, if you look at much of this literature around these issues, it's very anecdotal. It tends to be single case study. It tends to be not particularly systematic in terms of the data that underpin it. And so we're trying to bring some rigor to this. And so social network analysis has been key to trying to understand what are the actual dynamics that underpin some of these challenges at the sub-state level, at the non-state actor level, at the level of transnational organized crime. That's now believed to make up about 4% or so of global GDP. So it's a significant and growing challenge. And so we did a bunch of work around cross-border terrorist networks, around illicit financial flows, terrorist financing. So that's the empirical side there. Then the corollary to that is the transgovernmental enforcement networks that are emerging. So how are states responding to these challenges, and how are they trying to build capacity to enforce the rule of law in an environment where you can't simply do this anymore at a state level, or the bad guys usually have full domain awareness. If you think about sort of money laundering, for instance, issues where states only see one slice of this, and usually even the state doesn't see that whole slice. The state sees whatever it has given to some enforcement or intelligence agency. And so you have to be able to put together the whole picture to understand whether an activity that might deliberately be designed to look perfectly legal within that slice is actually, if you see the big picture, only then does it emerge that you have sort of illicit trends. And so there's very interesting collaborations emerging across, in particular, the what's known as the Five Eyes community, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, UK. There's interesting collaborations within Europe, but then there's also sort of these transnational efforts, everything from the UN Counterterrorism Executive Directorate trying to work with states, in particular in fragile regions, to we did some work on sort of Western Sahara, for instance, in that regard, to the EU pushing out through its neighborhood policy some of its efforts. So there's a whole lot of interesting sort of things that are happening here, and there's virtually no one who's actually writing about these transgovernmental enforcement efforts. So I think there we've been able to contribute at least something to the conversation. Then the second key contribution is that of getting away from understanding the borders that we do have as sort of these singular homogeneous entities. And so the work that sort of we did that's on Canada and on the different regions of Canada was intended to show that if you look at the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, the prairies, Alberta, BC, the north, that there's not really one Canada-US border. There's a series of borders here that have different historical components. There's different sort of regional identities. There's different borderlands identities. There's different flows of goods across these borders. There's different types of mobilities. There's even different understandings of security. So for instance, Stéphane Roussel and David Morin's paper on Quebec make it very clear that what Quebec understands and what Quebec prioritizes and Quebec's interests with regards to security are quite different from those that, for instance, Ottawa valorizes. And so trying to understand these nuances and sort of making the point that in the aftermath of 9/11, we have this tendency of states sort of make these centralized security policies that then sort of they try to apply uniformly across borders, and that this is often not a particularly helpful way of dealing with the challenges at different parts sort of across the country. But it's also very much sort of a high policing approach to often elite sort of state interests that can have very deleterious effects for local communities. And so trying also to understand, and this is sort of some of the work that Todd also has done, is how do local communities engage, push back, try to work within sort of these this aggressive centralization and change around border policy in the 9/11 era, and what can the central state learn in terms of making policies that are actually more nuanced and more differentiated and better adapted to the challenges, the needs, the interests, the priorities, the values that we find at different places along the border. And the third piece that we worked on and continue to work on is the oscillation. So bringing borders inwards. So if we talk about deportations, inland enforcement, those sorts of challenges, but also how the state is pushing borders outwards. If you think about pre-clearance, pre-inspection, and whatnot, and how borders in certain security dimensions are disappearing altogether. If you think about some aspects of global finance, if you think about the cybersphere, for instance, and so what does governance look like in these types of spaces where we don't necessarily have international institutions, so we don't have collaborations per se, and we're trying to do sort of ad hoc kinds of cooperative mechanisms to try to cope and to bring some sort of management to this. And the last sort of element in that interests us is how collaborations among countries are generating these global norms for how we deal with goods and trade and whatnot.